You've never been disturbed by strange noises and knocks from the basement in the middle of the night. Perhaps you just attributed everything to the creaking of the ceilings, the draft of rats. And imagine that while you are enjoying the fresh air, sunlight and delicious food in a dark basement, for several years now prisoners have been languishing. Underground is a cruel tormentor. Here are the inhabitants of a small Austrian town, Amstetten, and could not imagine that the basement of one of the houses served for 24 years. A dungeon for 4 people. How did it happen that in 2008 nothing? The remarkable town of Amstetten became sadly famous all over the world, and the surname Fritzl appeared on the main page of European newspapers with you fantom, and today you will learn about the blatant, a crime that received the laconic name of the body of her safari. Joseph Fritzl was a respected resident of the city of Amsterdam, if slightly reclusive, but like a strange man, forgave. After all, such a talented specialist in the field of electrics had to be looked for colleagues, and an employer spoke of him with reverence. The sight, even by Austrian standards, was different. Scrupulousness during work was never late and could come up with ingenious solution for any engineering issue. Add here a large 3-story house, 7 children and several properties around the city as one. In a word, a real exemplary citizen standing firmly on his feet. From the children of Fritzl, of which there were already 7 people, and the teachers and neighbors are always polite and courteous, regularly attending school. Of course, strictness reigned in the family. Father, blah, unquestioned authority, but how else to keep in check the 7 backbiters? Strict but fair. This is how Joseph Fried was characterized by the inhabitants of Amsterdam at the same time. The childhood of Fritzl himself can hardly be called happy. When the boy was 4 years, the mother kicked out of the father's house. The man not only ignored his duties, head of the family, but also caused a lot of trouble. As a result, the mother decided that it would be better for her not to have a husband at all, and a few years later, Franz Fritzl died in the war. As a result, young Elisabeth grew up in absolute poverty. Came to the point that the boy was fed by the neighbors, otherwise he simply would not have survived the Hungary military years. And yet, Fritzl's mother was exhausted. In order to somehow support a small family afloat, had to not only work hard for days on end, but also to keep her son alive with mittens. The woman did not fail. Joseph was able to get an education and got a job as a talented guy noticed, and very quickly the career of the hero went uphill. Soon she got married to an 18-year-old girl named Rosemary and started to fulfill his main dream. Fritzl dreamed of a big family, where he will be an authoritative and strict father, and indeed in the future. Rosemary gave birth to 7 children, as already mentioned. In the Fritzl family itself, enjoyed unbending authority. Children were forbidden to bring home guests to walk too long after school. In the presence of his father, no one dared to address him directly or say an extra word, but the inhabitants did not find anything wrong with this. The children represented the real pride of the Frieds, as everyone except daughter Elisabeth. Several times Elisabeth ran away from home, and the inconsolable father had to make considerable efforts to find and to bring home the prodigal daughter. Besides, sometimes the girl was seen in bars and surrounded by a dubious company. The inhabitants of Amstetten shook their heads sympathetically every time a father had to go in search of his child. Unfortunately, all the efforts of the old Fritzl were in vain. While the rest children got married, Elisabeth set off Breaking Bad, and in the end, joined some religious, left her parents. About it they found out after another long search. The daughter's apparently reckless act completely knocked Joseph down. He no longer hoped to find Eliza and began to lead another, more secluded lifestyle. To somehow distract himself, he devoted himself completely, building a bunker in the backyard, because the second half of the 20th century passed under the auspices of the constant threat of nuclear conflict. Since Austria was dangerously close to the socialist GDR, the government allowed citizens to build bunkers on case of a nuclear strike. Here is a free target, having received permission even before it disappears. Elisabeth decided to get a safe haven in case of disaster. However, a few more years passed and, reading the Ritzli, he began to discover next to his house strange finds. As it turned out, shameless Elisabeth not only left parents it began to periodically throw them their children. Apparently the rules of the sect forbade their members to breed for 24 years. Elisabeth's absence, her parents were forced to raise 3 children. Each time a child was accompanied by a note with a name and a short message. Joseph and Rosemary, despite the blatant impudence on the part of the daughter of Chita Fritzl, took the children into her family and provided for the kids everything you need. The neighbors were amazed at the responsible act of the new guardians. Liza, Monica and Alexander grew up. They entered the kindergartens of the school from their mother as before. No hearing or spirit about this is how the neighbors saw the history of the Fritzl family. and other residents of the city, their Bezout family neighbor who does not working hard to ensure their children a comfortable existence, and ungrateful daughter who only does what she throws frith on the threshold, their children. But everything changed radically on April 19, 2008. Elisabeth left another gift for parents, namely, their already adult daughter Kirsten State. The girls were rated as very difficult. Kirsten's organs began to fail. The body was so weakened as if the poor thing had spent several years sunless, light insufficient food. A note was also found on Fritzl's doorstep, in whom Elisabeth asked to take care of her daughter and promised to return to the nearest month. The situation was more than strange, but doctors faithful to the Hippocratic Oath did not. They began to sell unnecessary questions, and the first thing they rushed to save the life of the girl, while everyone was struck by the behavior. Joseph Fritzl, instead of staying in the hospital with his granddaughter, the man immediately left after asking the doctors do not involve the police in the case, and meanwhile the condition of Kirsten worsened. The girl's body was shaken by convulsions, and from the mouth, in which there were practically no teeth, continually oozed blood. In order to continue treatment, doctors needed the whole picture. What caused the attack? Were there such cases before? First aid was provided. Only one person could answer all these questions: Elisabeth, who, according to Fritzl, is still in an unknown sect. Because the bill went to the clock, the hospital administration decided to go for an unprecedented step. One of the medics recorded a video message to Elisabeth asking how, as soon as possible, to come to the hospital where her daughter was and explain the situation in as much detail as possible. Led through all state channels, and a miracle really happened. April 26, 2008, Elisabeth Fritzl reappeared on the streets of Amstetten 24 years after her disappearance. However, the police were already waiting in the hospital, and the girl, along with her father, who brought her, went to the clinic to testify against her. They were going to open criminal case and deprive of parental rights, but with just one look at Elisabeth, the officers of the law had certain questions. Outwardly female, looked hardly better, comatose daughter, skinny with rotten teeth and completely with a gray head, despite the fact that according to the passport, Elisabeth was 42 years old. She is 60. During the interrogation of Elisabeth, confirmed her father's version of while in the sect. At the same time, there were many inconsistencies in her words, and the phrase sounded as if they had been memorized in advance. And now, a few hours later, the woman promised to tell the whole truth, but on one condition: she must never see her father again. The policeman who conducted the interrogation gave the word of the officer, and Elisabeth began the story. Heard in the precinct will forever change the lives of people one way or another involved in stranger things in Amstetten. According to Elisabeth Jose Frith, the target introduced a double-life dear resident, a professional in his field and a family man at home, turned into a real monster as soon as the girl began to walk. Her father regularly rewarded her strong beatings for the slightest infraction went to other children. However, it was Elisabeth Fritzl who considered his favorite and expressed the location of such a perverted form over them by beating. The case was not limited. Starting from the age of 11, the girl was subjected to constant father's sexual abuse, and since Fritzl controlled every step, Elisabeth being beaten for the slightest deviation from the established rules by no one except for the perpetrator and the victim. He did not know about the terrible things that happened in the house on Strasse 40, but as time went on, Elisabeth grew up and less wanted to put up with orders established by her father. In addition, despite the psychological trauma of her twin-interest peers, all attempts to leave home were not at all a whim of a rebellious teenager while trying to escape from the house of horrors, but every time supposedly caring father found Elisabeth and returned home. According to the police, the climax of this history was a letter from a boyfriend intercepted by Fritz. Turned out to be young people planned to escape to somewhere far away to start a family and live happily. Then Fritzl realized that he would not be able to keep him with threats of beatings. Elisabeth was already completing the construction of the bunker during this period. Before, it is still unknown whether the father of the family really feared a nuclear war or originally built a prison for his own daughter. The criminal answers this question evasively, but the fact remains fact. Once Fritzl asked Elisabeth to go down to the basement, allegedly help in some business in the basement where the workshop was equipped, and put his daughter to sleep. The girl woke up with the drug already in complete darkness, chained, although not even a chain. Elisabeth still couldn't have escaped. The heavy door of the bunker was locked on. Electric lock, the cat from whom only the criminal knew, and yet the meticulous Frit. The target decided to play it safe. Elisabeth spent about 9 months on the chain. The first, while the girl tried to resist, she screamed with all her might and knocked in the blank walls of the bunker, earning more and more bruises. However, the room was perfectly isolated from the outside world, and no sound could penetrate. A thick layer of concrete and insulating materials, and at the top the Fritzl is actively spread rumors that the prodigal daughter left her home and entered into a certain religious sect, categorically refusing to return home, and in order not to be unfounded, he forced Elisabeth to write a letter and pasted stamps from a nearby. The city of Fritzl carefully checked the content of the message so that it did not contain not a hint of a request for help. Then several more letters followed, which finally lulled the vigilance of local officials and the police to residents. The city could only sympathize with the exemplary family man whose daughter is so. The criminal negligence of officials treated their parents ungratefully, more surprising in light of the fact that totalitarian sects are quite a typical phenomena for Austria. Yes, the whole world has heard of monstrous events when members of informal religious affiliations staged terrorist attacks both in Japan or a mass community as in the USA. However, in Catholic Austria, sects are not had great success. Nonetheless, none of the servants of the law bothered, though, to make inquiries. A legislation of the country also played a role, because the police did not is authorized to search for people who are already 18 years old. It is considered that an adult citizen can move freely around the country, thus a forged letter of inaction. Police, and most importantly, the impeccable reputation of the Joseph Fritzl, simply deleted the girl from life. Well, gone and gone has every right when the disappearance of Elisabeth is soon forgotten and the city returned to its former measured existence. Fritzl soon informed his prisoner about this, to finally kill the hope of freeing the girl. Nothing. All that remained was to come to terms with his unenviable fate, to endure regular bullying from his father and being content with the meager food that the jailer brought to the cellar. The days dragged on one after another, folding into months and years. Elisabeth's only amusement was to count the hours until the return of her tormentor, as well as remembering life before forced imprisonment. In addition to physical violence, Fritzl and psychologically tortured his victim. Every day he brought his daughter news from the upper world, told about successes. Her brothers and sisters remaining on the field are curious that almost all the children of Fritzl tried to get married or get married as soon as possible in order to leave the hated at home where everything obeyed the rules of the tyrant father, to only one son, also bearing the name Joseph. His father did not allow the young man to leave his father's house, who, due to from constant beatings, suffered from developmental delay. Stayed in the house as a servant. I helped my father in every possible way in his work. However, the Fritzl did not allow anyone to go down to the bunker under fear punishment, so even Joseph never crossed the forbidden threshold. About Rosemary's mother, and there is nothing to say she was probably more afraid of her husband. All household members not boldly take a step without permission. And then one day, Elisabeth felt that she was pregnant. She was in her 4th year of imprisonment and felt the girls were mixed. On the one hand, she knew what serious problems could to have a child conceived by close relatives. On the other hand, Elisabeth clung to the hope that her father take her to the hospital where there will be a chance to escape or ask for help from others people. But as Fritzl remained adamant the girl had to give birth on my own. The only thing my father did was bring to the medical literature bunker, therefore to the forced motherhood of Elisabeth. Prepared independently on August 30, 1988, the prisoners gave birth to a girl. Kirsten independently cutting the umbilical cord. Medical classes, textbooks were not in vain. As soon as the population of the bunker doubled, the island stood up. The question of expanding the living space was originally a bunker, a little more than a prison. Cameras, however, with the advent of the child, additional space was required, so Elisabeth had to dig the ground yourself so that Fritzl can equip additional rooms. As criminologists later find out, for 24 years of imprisonment, Elisabeth dug up so much land that it would take 17 Fritzl trucks to remove it. Turned out to be a generous jailer, but she spoke more than once during the investigation, equipped a small bathroom in the bunker to bathe, the Kirsten primitive kitchen, and even brought a washing machine. Of course, to some extent, the conditions of detention became more comfortable, but since there was very poor ventilation in the bunker, smells from food preparations were not weathered, and moisture from hygienic procedures led to the rapid growth of mold. Even one significant disadvantage of the dungeon was the low ceilings, the height of which was barely reached 170 centimeters, so an adult simply could not stand up in full growth. In addition to the lack of fresh air, the health of prisoners significantly undermined. Lack of vitamin D, which is known to be produced by skin contact with sunlight. The only source of light in the bunker were dim electric lamps. After birth, Kirsten Fritzl seriously thought about having a second one in the bunker. A full-fledged family with a difference of 2 years was born. Stefan, Lisa, Monica, and Alex Oral continued to give birth on her own, guided by teaching aids and personal experience. But with the advent of the third child, Fritzl decided a little change their plans, either because the girl was born sickly and too cried a lot, either because the bunker could accommodate a limited number of people. The maniac decided to get rid of newborn Despite the terrible wording, Fritzl did not kill baby. When Lisa was 9 months old, he confronted Elisabeth with a fait accompli. The girl will grow upstairs, followed by the story of the foundling, and, with a letter from the deceased, the Fritzl again handed paper and pen to his daughter and dictated a new message. So Lisa left the bunker. Same luck, smiled, and 2 other children, Monica and Alex. Fritzl got custody of children and began to receive decent money from the state for their maintenance. Therefore, in Fritzl's act, the investigators are not an act of humanism, but a cunning calculation at that. While the maniac was doing badly, and he even had to set fire to one of his household to get insurance payouts, and the money from the state helped him not only pay off your debts but also continue to lead a very prodigal lifestyle. After all, Fritzl was a big fan of holidays in Thailand, where, according to colleagues, spent all his time in local brothels. In 2002, for the last time, Elisabeth gave birth to her father, but since the girl did not have the opportunity to do an ultrasound until recently, she did not suspect that she was pregnant with twins. As a result, succeeded only one child, Felix, whose brother subsequently posthumously will be called Michael, died 2 days later. Alicia then had to figure it out for a long time. Would have been able to save the second child if the goal had brought Elisabeth to hospital. In this case, the maniac would face another charge of murder by criminal inaction. When Fritzl once again went down to the basement and found the dead child, he took body and in cold blood burned it in a garbage oven, thereby destroying all traces. A few more years passed. The children on the surface continued to live a full life without suspecting that literally a few meters away their brothers and the sisters in prison grew old, and the Fritzl himself lived in 2 families. It became more and more difficult for the fading organism to cope with the need to carry heavy bags of food into the bunker. And then, in my head, maniac matured. Fritz's plan decided that it was time to release the captives to freedom. Yes, it was risky, but the father of 2 families had an indisputable authority and was sure that the frightened children would support the legend of being in sect. This perfectly explained the painful appearance of the prisoners. They say everyone who kept Elisabeth with the children in terrible conditions, and the girls miraculously managed to get out. Fritzl began to cook households to big changes in their lives. However, the sudden illness of Kirsten greatly accelerated the course of events. Despite the fact that the sunless light and fresh air, the children often fell ill. Elisabeth had only aspirin and syrup from cough, and that's when the eldest daughter, already not distinguished by iron health, lost consciousness and began to convulse. Fritzl decided that it was time to go to the hospital. Further history we know the tormentor. Nevertheless, he took the Kirsten to the hospital, but the vigilant doctors did everything to get the police, so the terrible story of the house at Ipstrasse 40A was revealed. A respectable resident of the city, her name is Fritzl, showed his true animal face while the police were studying the terrible bunker and interrogating Fritzl, and journalists from all over the world flooded you with something of his prisoners, because for photographs of Elisabeth and her children, the largest publications promised. Millions of journalists were on duty for hours at the walls. Hospitals where the inhabitants of the basement were transported, stubborn paparazzi burrowed into land to deceive the motion sensors installed around the perimeter of the clinic, ambushed trees, and even fought with security and police. As a result, the Austrian authorities created a blacklist of journalists who especially tried to violate the privacy of the victims of a maniac. It is worth mentioning especially about Stephanie and Felix, who were the last to leave the underground dungeon. The boys were taken from the basement to twilight so that sunlight does not damage their eyes. For many years accustomed to darkness in the future, they still went outside for a long time in dark glasses and sunscreen applied to the skin. In prison, the children could only communicate with each other, the mother and the one who inflicted Fritzl visits, so their vocabulary was severely limited. However, Elisabeth did her best to teach sons the German language and basic skills of writing and reading. It is curious that a huge role played the television that Fritzl also brought to the bunker. The blue screen became for the children a window into a world they had never seen before. Did not see. Therefore, coming to the surface, the brothers had idea about cars, mobile phones, knew this is how the trees look like, the sky, the sun, and moon. The problem was that the TV showed all this in a 2-dimensional plane. Therefore, Stefan and Felix soon had problems with the perception of real objects, and yet Felix, who at the time of release was only 5 years old, showed excellent progress. Like any child, he was open to everything new and enthusiastically accepted his first car trip. Yes, while the boy preferred move on all fours, but proper nutrition and exercise, according to doctors, should have to help rectify the situation. Things were much worse for 18-year-old Stefan. The low ceiling did not allow the young man to stand up to his full height, so he was forced to stoop heavily, and Stefan's social skills were seriously affected. Miss the period when adolescents are in an active phase of socialization when everyone wants to make friends and learn together with each other. The doctors expressed fear that the young man was unlikely to be able to become a full-fledged member of the society. Officials did not know what to be surprised more: cruelty and designs. Fritzl, or the ingenuity with which he arranged the bunker entrance to dungeon carefully hidden in the workshop, blocked a massive, reinforced concrete door during the search. It took several strong men to move it from its place. Ingenious Fritzl, on the other hand, equipped the door with a special mechanism and could easily open and it's scary to imagine what fate awaited the prisoners if something happened to their tormentor. Mother and children would be doomed to starvation and no one would ever found their bodies. And although he himself and the ghoul swore that in this case he always set a timer that would open the door after a while, nothing like that. The investigator was not found behind the door of the officers waiting for a narrow corridor which successively led to a conditional kitchen, then to the bathroom and ended with 2 tiny bedrooms. However, the investigators, with all their desire, could not be in bunker for more than an hour. Stale air, lack of oxygen, and closed space did their job, so the servants of the law periodically replaced each other. Is terrible too. Imagine what it was like for Elisabeth, who spent in inhuman conditions for 24 years in Austrian society. Resumed again unpleasant discussions. Not so long ago the whole country was shocked by another basement, a matter of history. Natasha Kampusch, whom the maniac kept in the house for more than 8 years, and now even more egregious case, as someone even called Austria a country of cellars, asking how many more people can be underground. When the story became public, journalists were able to find in the archives of newspapers a mention that our hero was "We are convicted of rape and even served a prison term." Why this was not known earlier, and here we rest against the letter of the Austrian law. All criminal affairs in the country are destroyed after 10 years, considered at the same time part of the rehabilitation program and the realization of the right to privacy. In addition, testimonies of people who filmed at different times began to emerge immediately. Rooms in the ill-fated house, after all, renting out housing, one of the sources of Fritzl's income. Yes, in that very house people rented, the guests recalled that Fritzl really regularly dragged some things in the basement, and at night quiet knocks were heard from below. The police, and I'm sure that the maniac did not have accomplices. One secret of the bunker, after all, remains unsolved. Fritzl was well versed in electrics, but the gasket, the bunker's plumbing, caused him difficulty, so he turned to plumber who did his job at one home. The identity of this person has not yet been established. It is worth noting that at first the police suspected and Rosemary Fritzl's wife. However, there was no evidence against her. It was impossible to say for sure whether she knew about everything or not. Mother, the criminal, probably forever harbored a grudge against the human race and dreamed of only one thing: about absolute power. When the children began to slowly to leave his home, he decided to get out of the situation in a completely sophisticated way, to create a new family, the power over which would be absolute. For this purpose and was an underground prison was built in which Fritzl became not just the father of a family, but practically God, because life directly depended on his visits. Unfortunate prisoners. Joseph Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment. Criminals were imputed not only from force and enslavement, but also negligent homicide. Fritzl is in jail under constant surveillance. Too much prisoners want to commit lynching over a maniac. At the same time, it is noted that he receives in sympathy letters from some women they have seen in him before, of a confused person in life who only wanted to save his daughter from alcohol and illegal substances. However, they themselves would like to be in place. Elisabeth history. Meanwhile, children from the basement are not only passing the course rehabilitation but also spend time with their siblings who grew up on surfaces under the laws of Austria, as well as due to excessive media interest in the victim. Fritzl received documents for new names and their location carefully. Hiding from strangers. Will a new name and a new house help at least partially? Forget the years spent in the basement in inhuman conditions is unknown, but let's hope that the rest of the life of Elisabeth, her children, will work out in the best way.